Recognized that the progress of their people and nation depended upon fusion with the ever-growing tourist industry and preservation of its assets, namely the landmass and ocean. The government realized that it had two main problems to overcome. Firstly, Anguilla had only limited exposure to the traveling public. Secondly, the image that existed was that of a high-end, limited-access destination. Early on, Anguilla had determined that it would only offer superior quality to its guests. That it has done. Entering this decade, it became evident that a much larger piece of the traveling industry pie could be had with a new approach. But that approach could not encroach on quality. The job would neither be cheap nor easy. The Anguillian government set about the task of determining just what tools it had to work with. Heading the list was superior quality resorts, a fine modern airport, a proud enthusiastic populace, excellent restaurants, the island landmass, and last but not least, the beautiful ocean. Using these tools, they decided to develop in two directions. One, ecological, and two, improved numbers of travelers during the historic slow season. To address the ecological issue, a marine task force was established by the Anguillian government. Made up of a diverse group of business and social leaders, their job was to review the ecology of Anguilla and find solutions to the problems that existed. The most visible problems: litter in inappropriate places around the island, and most obvious, the derelict ships in Road Bay. As discussion circulated through the villages and countryside, several other interesting facets came to the forefront. For some time, fishing, an important part of Anguillan industry, had begun to wane. This added another dimension to the problem solver's bag of chores. The Marine Task Force set about gathering intelligence. They talked with leading fishermen, business leaders, and the community in general. Armed with the information from this effort, several important facts came to light. Road Bay, considered one of the world's most beautiful bays, must be cleaned up. This would improve the island's image for tourism. With the number of wreck sinkings being planned, Anguilla would, for the first time, have a shot at tapping the lucrative scuba diving market. 7 ships would make Anguilla the wreck diving capital of the Caribbean. The second benefit would be improved navigational safety. The task force had to ask itself, what problems would these improvements create? How do you properly remove and sink giant rusty hulks of abandoned ships? Most troubling, how do you move the Sarah, a 220-ton ship lying half-submerged on its side in the middle of Road Bay? The Marine Task Force came to the realization that more forces were at play here than first thought. Going back to the problem of low fish populations and taking another perspective, the idea occurred. Wouldn't the derelict ships create new fishing habitat? This type project has been very successful in Florida and other places in the Gulf of Mexico. Why wouldn't it work for Anguilla as well? Suddenly, 3 definite benefits were evident. The first 2, tourism and ecology, and now stimulation of the fishing industry by introducing artificial reefs. Still, the cleanup method and funds eluded them. However, funds were of no consequence if the job of moving the wrecks couldn't be accomplished. After reviewing many bids, the task force contacted Joe Farrell at his company, Resolve Salvers, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Mr. Farrell is a noted expert in the type of salvage that was needed. A few days later, at the crack of dawn, divers entered the water around the Sarah and commenced what was later to become one of the Caribbean's major ecological projects. While divers probed the Sarah, other experts combed over the derelicts stranded on the rocks. As reports filtered back to the task force, it was learned that moving the stranded ships would present only the usual problems. The Sarah was a different story altogether. Besides the original damage, after 6 years in the water, the Sarah was littered with hull damage from corrosion. Beyond the hull damage, her position in the water created a very unique set of problems for the salvers. Now the Marine Task Force had to weigh the cost against the benefits. Could Anguilla afford such an undertaking? But more important, could Anguilla afford not to? Favor was found with the latter. The old nemesis, public opinion, was now to rear its fearsome head. Anguilla needed to improve certain school facilities, other projects that seemed more noble patchworked the government agendas. But how about long range? What far-reaching benefits would come from cleaning up the harbor and creating the artificial reef system? The answers became apparent as the Marine Task Force examined evidence from other countries that had done similar but smaller projects. Cleaning up the bay would improve tourism. In fact, it would help efforts to sell more tourism in the slow season, especially bringing in budget-minded scuba tourists to dive the wrecks. The fishing industry should derive economic benefits from better catches. Combined, they would generate long-term income for Anguilla. With the prospect of long-term revenues, school and other government projects could be planned. One pressing problem still existed: where to get the money. The public was still skeptical. The fishing industry was only partially convinced. These areas became the main priority of the Marine Task Force. Hundreds of man and woman hours went into putting the project together. Private businesses and citizens contributed, slowly at first, and then enthusiastically. The capital was raised to move the stranded ships. What about the Sarah? It would be the most costly, around $250,000. Joe Farrell came up with what proved to be the final solution. Joe agreed to raise the Sarah, move her and sink her in the line of developing artificial reefs. Better yet, he understood that failure to move the Sarah would yield absolutely no benefit to Anguilla. Putting his money where his mouth is, to coin a phrase, Joe agreed to perform the feat at his own expense. He agreed to be paid only if successful. Routinely, at first, the salvors started work on the stranded ships, then large quantities of materials started arriving at Road Bay. Huge steel casings, welding equipment, rolls of cable, plate steel, and much more crowded the pier. To move the Sarah, 3 special tripods capable of withstanding hundreds of tons of tension had to be erected and secured to the hull. Once the work began, it went around the clock. At night, Road Bay became a fireworks display as welders secured boilerplate steel to the hull and tripods. Support tender ships and tugs hovered close to the work. Not even the members of the Marine Task Force had imagined the magnitude of this undertaking. At this point, nothing was routine. Every day presented new problems and difficulties. The sand beneath the ship was impacted and very difficult to remove. Joe had determined that a trench the length of the ship had to be excavated so the hull, when righted, would be nearly vertical on its axis. Weather, for the most part, remained favorable as excavation beneath the ship proceeded. Television crews, newspaper reporters, and freelance writers for magazines scrambled to get coverage of the process. The effort was making world press. As the effort to raise the Sarah continued, the other ships were gradually being towed into position and sunk. Perfect keel sinkings were accomplished. This kept the spirit of the workers and the Anguillians up. It was a good thing because the Sarah remained stubborn. Finally, everything was in place to pull the ship over into the trench and onto her keel. From here, the ship could be floated and towed away to her final resting place. For hours, the salvors and sailors worked to right the ship. Finally, she surrendered and came to about 20 degrees off keel position. She could be raised, but it would be no mean task. New holes developed and pumps overheated, cables shredded, the timbers grew short. It took days, but then in an almost calm, Sarah rose to the surface and was put under tow. Today, 6 ships form the great artificial reef of Anguilla. Her harbor is clean, her beauty restored. On the island, volunteers continued cleaning up the landscape. Through the efforts of the land crew, debris and old car hulks were collected, removed too, and loaded aboard the ships before sinking. All possible pollutants were removed to make the sinking as clean as possible. The ships were so clean that Scuba World television series research divers discovered new schools of fish on them after only 5 days at the bottom. Anguilla, the Marine Task Force, and Heritage Society have accomplished a feat normally expected of the deep-pocket megapowers. Ingenuity, pride, cooperation, and determination resulted in a clean, beautiful coastline, ecological restoration of the land, improved tourist traffic, in particular a new tourism segment, scuba diving, and more fish for the hardy Anguillan fishing fleet. Born of pride and achieved with hard work, Anguilla has proven what can be accomplished when a family of friends set about protecting and enhancing their environment. Their efforts were endorsed and supported by friends from around the world, such as American Airlines, Scuba World television series, and friends from within, such as the Anguillian hotel and tourist industry, Windward Air, the government, and the people.